Well, good morning, everybody. There we go. Welcome, welcome. Welcome to Transition Day, where we get a mix of the EDU audience and the South by audience. It's great to have all of you here. I think one of the things that I've been talking to the panel about before we started was just, hey, there's a lot of people here, but the topic is kind of broad, like moonshots. What does this audience actually want out of this conversation? So one of the things that I like to do when I moderate a conversation is actually try to pull the audience in the beginning rather than the end. So one of the things that you all can do using your slide out technology that you have on your app is actually say, what are things you hope this panel covers? And actually put that in. And so I'll get a little screenshot of those, and then it'll be nice to actually hear what are things that you actually want out of this panel. And so I'm going to take a second for you all to sort of start to do that. And as we start to get going, I guess one just like very basic place to start is, you know, moonshot is a word that gets thrown around a lot. You know, people say everything from, you know, President Kennedy and like the moonshot, you know. And then there's like, moonshots is just like a way to think about ambitious thinking. How do I sort of stretch? And so I'd be curious just to first do a little bit of just stage setting on like, you know, when you use the word, what are some of the ideas and specific examples that come to you? And maybe I'll start with Aarti, and I'll just sort of brag on Aarti a little bit. This is like my favorite thing to do, because, you know, my background was first in the government. I worked for President Obama in his science office, and then have done a bunch of things since. But as like a little, you know, junior staffer that was, you know, working on science technology in government, I remember Aarti, she was director of DARPA at the time, invited me to what are these famed things called the DARPA pizza parties, which are these like, all the DARPA program officers sit around and they kind of debate what are the next set of crazy programs that they should come up with, and Aarti would host these. And she's like, you should come hang out, have pizza, and listen to them brainstorm. And it was like so nerdy and so amazing. So, you know, so Aarti's been at all of these really important levels. I mean, one of the things that I often say is Aarti was in the room making the case for mRNA funding that DARPA led. That was a big part of how we got the COVID vaccine. So we are incredibly thankful for your service. But Aarti, like, you've been in all these moments when the word moonshot gets thrown around. Do you cringe, or do you think about like specific ideas as to what the word means for you?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here with Kumar, all of my colleagues, and hey, everyone, it's great to be in Austin. I think the term moonshot gets overused, but listen, at core, this is the most American idea you could possibly imagine, which is we're not okay with just making a little bit of progress. We're going to go for broke, and we've done this in so many areas. And today we're going to talk about how we bring that approach to changing outcomes for our kids and changing education. That's still a new idea, and I think sometimes we have trouble imagining being able to make big steps forward in education because the problem seems so intractable. But I got to tell you, it's not that long ago that we didn't think we could really make that much progress on medicine, or exploring space, or even the tech that's consuming our world today. And so what's now coming in focus, I think, is the opportunity for those kinds of really big leaps, building on all the other things you need, the incremental, the infrastructure, the basic research. But when you start having those pieces, then it's time to go big, and that's what moonshots are all about to me.
And give them like an example of like, if somebody was like, you know, you often have folks reach out to you and say, what's like something big we should be going after? Are there like examples that come to you from minds of like, why aren't we working on this? You know, this should be like a moonshot that we as a country or as a company or as a person, you know, what sort of like a thing you're really excited about right now?
Well, there are a lot right now, I think, and you're going to talk, I hope, about what you're doing on, and you and Steve in particular, on there's so many ways that AI is coming into education. I think a lot of the stories I hear are people reeling from dealing with it, and that's happening. But it's also a powerful thing we can seize to actually do the work that we've been wanting to do for a long time. Maybe I'll just tell a story where we know a lot about how it turned out, and I'll tell the mRNA story. I had the privilege of serving at DARPA and the Defense Department early in my career. I went off and did other things. I came back 19 years later. Everything had changed. Geopolitics had changed, and technology had changed. All the people had changed. One of my program managers, when I came back to lead DARPA in 2012, many years before the pandemic, one of my program managers was an epidemiologist, an MD, PhD, and oh, by the way, an Air Force colonel. And he said, look, one day we're going to have another pandemic. It's going to look like 1918 with everyone in hospital cots because, Mother Nature cooks up these new bugs all the time. He knew that we had to get better at being prepared for it. And he said one of the problems is it takes years or decades or never to come up with a vaccine that really works. But he said there is this research in mRNA, and it could be the basis for a rapid response vaccine platform. Now, sitting here in 2026, that's obvious. Many of us have that vaccine, and we've had that vaccine. But I have to tell you, in 2012, that was crazy talk. People had seen the research. They said, that's cute. Like, that's so far from reality. We'll never get there, or maybe, it's going to take decades. And my program manager, Dan, said, no, we have to do this now because we don't know when there's going to be another pandemic. We have got to get after it. And he undertook to do that. He told me he had just met a startup called Moderna. They were working on mRNA for cancer. I used to be a venture capitalist. I got why they were working on cancer. You can always make money, tragically. You can always make money solving cancer. Infectious disease you cannot count on. But with both a big vision and some real substantial funding, Dan was able to get Moderna to start working on infectious disease. And the pivot point, his moonshot, was to show immune response in human beings in a clinical trial. And he got only as far as the phase 1 clinical trial, which was a safety trial. It proved that the vaccine, this is way before COVID, it proved that particular mRNA vaccine, I think it was for a disease called chikungunya, that it was safe, but it also showed immune response in the patients who had gotten it in the clinical trial. That's when all the skeptics started saying, wait a minute, maybe we should be paying attention. And fortunately, that happened in 2017. Now, it took a lot of miracles for the world's fastest, safe, and effective vaccine development to happen in the pandemic that we're just coming through now. But the part that we contributed was the fact that Moderna was able to ship doses for clinical trials, doses of that COVID-19 vaccine, 42 days after they knew what the sequence for the spike protein needed to look like. So that's a moonshot, because we changed outcomes. And ultimately, it's fun to do cool and sexy things. What I really care about is, does it change the way the future unfolds? And I think those kinds of opportunities are now everywhere in front of us.
I mean, I think it's an incredible story. It's ambitious thinking. It's picking something really hard that's important in the world. It's taking risk. It's the role of government, it's the role of company, it's the role, of a bunch of different players. So I think there's powerful sort of lessons there. Eden, why don't we keep going down the initial conceit of the word moonshot can mean many things, and just sort of continue to kind of build out the word. What does it mean to you? How do you bring it to the way you think about ambitious philanthropy or your own personal life, and introduce yourself?
Well, I don't have any fabulous stories about DARPA and saving the world with vaccines. But hello, everybody. It's really, really awesome to be here with incredible people. My name is Eden Xenakis. I'm the Chief of Staff at the Bezos Family Foundation. Our work focuses on young people and learning and thriving from birth to adolescence. We've been around for about 25 years. We understand that learning doesn't happen in a moment or in a single place, so we really consider the entire ecosystem, the communities, the educators, the families, and all of the systems that work together to help young people thrive. Fun fact, I'm from Austin. This is where I grew up. I went to McCallum High School, not too far from here. And my mom, who I think is somewhere in the audience, if she made it through security. Oh, you made it through security! Just kidding, Mom. But she was someone that was deeply engaged in civic participation, showing up, pitching in, and what that meant for me was tagging along with her to campaign phone banks with my bag of snacks while she sat with a voter list, dialing number after number, calling voters to remind them to vote. At one point, I even had a campaign job. I was paid a penny for every envelope I licked of a campaign mailer, and 10-year-old me thought that was pretty amazing. I mean, 100 envelopes for $1 can get you, back then, could get you far. But it really shifted the way I started thinking about it for a couple reasons. One, young people can do something larger than them. It's not just the adults in the room, and that was really eye-opening for me then, and even as I reflect back. And just from a moonshot perspective, it was like, civic engagement is a moonshot. It might be the ultimate moonshot, because if you think about convincing millions and millions of people to participate and make change and use their voice and vote on issues that matter to them with the confidence that they can change the world around them. I mean, that's a pretty amazing feat, and that's what we try to do at the foundation. We really focus on helping people learn and thrive and know that they too can change their community, their world, things bigger than them.
Yeah, what I like about that is, like, if you think about President Kennedy, if you think about all this, there is a storytelling element, but there's also like what is the work of the many? How do moonshots inspire others, both around what they want to do, but also around the goal itself? So I think there's like an interesting thread to pull on. So Steve, I feel like I'd be curious what the word means to you, but you sit in this like very interesting world of Carnegie Mellon, in part, which is a university I think that, like, I feel like every faculty member, every student is like dreaming up, like, here's the thing I'm going to do to solve things. You were part of a spin out of somebody that was thinking about like the role technology could do on learning long before. I mean, you guys were talking about AI in education before.
You're making me feel old,
but like, talk a little bit about like when you spun out and started building Carnegie Learning. What was the moonshot? What was the word and idea that drove that creation of the company? And then when you now internally are sitting around and saying the word, oh, what's the big goal? What's the moonshot? How do you sort of think about it in like or does that word not make sense in a corporate setting?
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. I mean, I feel like we're always thinking about different moonshots, but forming the company was a big one. Because my background was in cognitive psychology. We were a group that was in the psychology department at Carnegie Mellon, working with computer science and with the Pittsburgh Public Schools. So that was the partnership. We started working in mathematics. And I think our original view was, well, we know how people think and learn and perform. And so if we know how people think, learn, and perform, we should be able to use that knowledge to help them learn better. And we went out to the schools and we discovered that the schools were not really focused on how people learn. They were much more focused on how we should teach, and institutionally, like, how do we structure schools, right? What's the schedule? Where do the teachers come from? How do we train the teachers? What materials do we give to students? And all that stuff is important, but if it doesn't change the student's brain, it's all for waste, right? And so what we started with was this view of, let's first focus on the student. Look at the impact of whatever the student's being asked to do or listen to or perform on what the student knows and is able to do, and think about it from that perspective. And what was just stunning to me was how different a perspective that was than what most people in education were thinking about. So my moonshot really is focusing on that. And I'll say, like, we've been doing AI since the beginning. It was, Carnegie Mellon, everything. was computer focused, right? So when I say like building models of how people think and learn, those were AI models that tried to duplicate how people learn. And we embedded that in the software that students use so that it could understand what the students were thinking about, how they were thinking about problem solving, and support them in that. And that, I'm sure we'll talk quite a bit about AI, but to me, I'm an AI optimist because I see AI as not a way to replace thinking, but a way to understand and augment human thinking.
And how does it, like, what's the limit of that? Like, I feel like you still need to make money. You still need to build products that work. So when you're the chief R&D officer and thinking about how do we stretch, what is the shape of how this translates into like an actual goal statement where like, we want to get to this capability in Y time, and here's how we're going to spend our R&D dollars.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I come from a background in cognition, but motivation is equally as important. And I think, like, in the age of AI, it's especially important to think about motivation in the broad sense of students thinking, like, why am I here and what does my future look like, right? And we don't have good answers for that. But I'll say, like, what's really optimistic when you get into schools, kids really do want to learn. They'll say sometimes they don't, especially the older kids. But they really do if you give them things that are worthwhile learning. When we give students tools, AI tools that give them the answer, if it's a task that they don't care about, they're very happy to take the answer and move on. If it's something that they care about, if you give them authentic tasks that they really want to understand and to do, they don't want the answer given to them. They want to use that AI as a tool to succeed. So that requires like a real change in the way we structure what we do in schools.
So let's, I think we've had AI mentioned a couple times, and we're living in a technical age, and I think it's like useful to unpack what technical moment we're in, right? So you could have had this Moonshots conversation 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 10 years ago, today, and there's a lot of like, well, everything is different. And it'd be useful to sort of unpack, if we're living in this S-curve of improving computational capability, where is it making things easier? Is it increasing the chance that we can set more ambitious goals, and on what? And then what are the limits of the moment we're sort of living through? I'll just say at Renaissance, we, along with Carnegie Learning, have a program that we created called the Learning Engineering Virtual Institute. The goal of that program was, can we basically replicate this 2012 JPAL result that showed that you could, through a mix of high dosage tutoring, double the rate of middle school math learning for low-income kids. The problem with that 2012 study was it was $4,000 per kid. So school systems said, that is a very high price point. So even if the result is amazing, we can't adopt it. So the goal of the program was, can you replicate that result? Can you do it at scale? And can you do it at under $1,000 per kid, if not under $500 per kid? We have multiple teams in that program, multiple teams on track to potentially achieving the goal of that program. We're in year 4. But what's been interesting for us has been that, living through this AI improvement curve has made everyone's job easier. That doesn't mean that there's lots of failure under the hood, but suddenly certain types of strategies that the teams had became way easier to implement, and the number of experiments, I get these reports on all the experiments the teams are doing, and the rate of productivity has shot up. So yeah, Steve, do you want to just say a little bit about, just at a practitioner level, where is the fact that, what used to be $1,000 buys me this many tokens that gets me this, and now we have if Moore's law is things double every 18 months, I think one way to think about the AI law is token costs are dropping 100x during 18 months. So something that costs you $100,000 to do costs you $1,000 to do in that same 18-month period. So then you do that twice, and now you're going from million to 1,000. So that's not magic, but it does, when those capabilities happen, some things become easier. So just give some examples of where it's happening and what the limitations are.
Yeah, so one of the things we know about what helps students learn is active learning, right? Give them problems to solve, give them good feedback as they solve those problems, right? And that's sort of the essence of what we've been doing for many years. But the feedback has always been text-based because we want to give personalized, specific feedback to students, and we can generate a sentence and give that sentence in text. And what we proposed for the Levy program was sort of crazy at the idea at the time, because it was before GPT 3.5 came out, which is kind of the first version of ChatGPT that most people saw. And we said, well, what if that feedback could be a video, or could be a custom diagram or animation to help explain a concept to a student? And it came from sort of thinking about, like, well, we can identify sort of common misconceptions that students have, and we can create video and animations and responses to that. But when you think about the scale of what you would need to create, it's enormous, because, you know, we went through our Mathia program and found over 3 million different personalized messages that we gave to students, right? So you couldn't anticipate building 3 million videos, but now you can, right? You can have animations and video and diagrams and other multimodal feedback for students that we just couldn't have thought of before.
So Arthi, you know, I'd be curious how you're sort of processing the AI moment, both on here are things, you know, whether in education or more broadly, that suddenly seem more possible, so we should be increasing our ambition on them. And then I think the other part also, which is, you know, where are we more in hope casting and saying, like, this is actually, you know, as like a serious technologist who had to, like, when your, you know, DARPA program officers came and pitched, and you had to poke and say, you're enthusiastic, but I don't think this is going to net it.
That was the fun part.
You know, so like, if you were doing the equivalent of product review for a moonshot, where's AI as a capability, and what are its deficiencies?
Well, let me start. In this AI moment, first of all, I feel like we're talking about AI as if it is a monolithic thing. The people who are building the biggest models have that vision. And I think we've all just sort of blindly started talking about AI the way they talk about it, that it will be the big model that will do everything. That's not actually what's going on. And the moment we're in, remember a number of years ago where every product had an E before it, like it was e-commerce, it was e-everything, and then there was a wave where everything had a .com in the name? I think we're in that moment with AI, where it's the thing, and so everything we talk about is AI. The shift that we need to make, and I think we need to get going because the real consequences, is instead of thinking about AI as the thing, if you think about it as a tool that enables many, many, many things, I think that's just a much more constructive way to go at it. For a lot of people today, when you say AI, they are picturing the interaction that they have with a chatbot, often on a daily basis. That may have almost nothing to do with an image generator that allows for a personalized animation that, you know, responds to a specific issue that a student's having. But they both have AI in them. So I think we need to be a lot clearer in our conversations. Look, the potential here, this is like every other powerful technology in all of human history. All of human history tells us that we human beings are going to use this technology for good and for ill. The entire ball game is how do we seize those benefits and manage the risks. Listen, the reason I'm a science and technology person is I know that all of human history tells me that sometimes we screw it up and we do have real problems, but eventually we figure out how to use these powerful new advances in technology in ways that really do take us forward and that minimize and manage and curtail the risks. That is the whole ball game today on AI. And in education, I'm watching students and teachers and administrators in every school I know are grappling with the fact that it's a tsunami, that students have very easy access to it, and everyone's confused and there's a lot of anxiety about how to use it wisely. Then there are specific applications, these dreams we've had of personalized tutoring. We know that this is the one thing. Talk about move the needle. This moves the needle for students. We've known that for a long time, but we've also known that if it's $4,000 a student, it's just a dream. It's not going to be real. So finding ways to take this powerful technology, use it safely, responsibly, in very directed, targeted ways, that's such a huge opportunity. And you two have talked about the technology. Part of what I remember about what you're doing that I think is so important is that it's not just giving a kid an AI tool and letting them go figure it out. There's a human, a tutor that's curating. You should talk about this part. Because again, look, we can have all the technology in the world, but we know that these processes, how children learn and grow and mature, is such a deeply human process. And I think the fact that you've been very clear about that being integral, you're taking advantage of how sexy the technology is, but it's still, I think, a very human process.
Yeah, I mean, just on that, I mean, one of the things that we've sort of seen inside this program is that it's not like a clean dichotomy between teachers and human instructors and digital tutors. It's actually lots of blended approaches where you're using a mix of those approaches to do different things. So for example, there's another Carnegie Mellon team that's in the program, and what they do is they call it dynamic dosing. So you have one tutor, human tutor, there are 4 students, 2 of the students are put on a digital tutor, 2 of the students are getting direct instruction. As a student gets stuck on the work, the tutor kind of moves around and sort of focuses on them while the other ones do it on the digital tutor. And then all of it is then getting inputted back to the teacher to inform classroom practice. You get these huge affordances because some of the students, for sections of the work, are running ahead. But when they get stuck for lots of random reasons. You don't get just stuck because you don't understand the concept. It's like the technology stops working. It's like, I don't understand why this is happening. Oh, the kid next to me is distracting me. All these things, which like, it's way easier for the tutor there to sort of figure out why did you get stuck? And then what are the concepts that they're struggling with that you can then inform the teacher with? So, but the actual cost model of a tutor plus digital tutor pairing with a classroom, that whole cost model, is a lot cheaper. But it's not, oh, we're just going to flip the switch between a digital tutor and classroom instruction. So one of the things that I think, the reason why I think these are applied problems is we are building powerful new tools, but how those tools actually make us be able to like do stuff is an open question. So, I mean, Eden, you all fund early education, you all fund education more generally, youth in lots of ways. I'm sure AI comes up as a, both on like, as a tool, but also just like, children are having to navigate now this technology showing up in their lives. Just talk a little bit about how it's showing up in your strategy, at least as open questions, as both an opportunity and a possible liability.
Yeah, we talk about AI constantly at the foundation. And like I said earlier, we really are looking at the entire ecosystem of the learners. And so an area that we're really exploring right now is human connection in the age of AI. We know that there are rising levels of young people's loneliness and really less opportunities for human connection for them, which we also know is a really important part of healthy development. So I think that this is a really important moment to bring together the technologists, the educators, the families, the young people themselves to start looking at what's happening here. And our job as a philanthropist is to come in and knit those communities and those people and those sectors together, help them get moving in the right direction, turn instinct into impact. Yeah, so that's really where we're focused right now. I mean, you guys are doing a good job of talking about the technical aspects and all of the learning tools, but I feel like this is an area that's also really important to keep in mind.
Yeah, I guess just to sort of dig in, I guess one, because, you can have these sort of more technically ambitious moonshot goals, but I think like an emergence of a technology and how it actually integrates into our lives can end up being like a huge gap as to whether it actually happens or not, right? So we started with vaccines as like a huge technical win. We are living through an age where the social dimensions of vaccines are falling apart all around us. And like the net effect is like we're having huge technology wins while we're actually taking huge setbacks on the public health side. So like, how do we actually navigate, and some of this is politics and some of this is lots of other things, but how do we actually navigate the social dimensions of a technology ends up having this really outsized impact as to whether we get the upside or not. So, I mean, I don't think this is like an idle point, Eden, right? This is like, if we don't get this right, like what's gonna be the response? Like, let's ban all the technology, let's ban all the phones, let's ban, you know what I mean? Like, where do we end up? So, like, Aarti, like, what's your advice around, I mean, you sat working directly for a president, all these questions are questions of trade-offs. How do we build, you know, the word responsible innovation sounds kind of vague, right? So it's like, how do we actually build trust, but also get to actually get the good stuff, you know? Because it's like, we have to manage between a feeling of like, we can't get the next thing, and like we're actually being thoughtful in how it sort of plays out. So how do these conversations sort of play out in ways that you think are important for when we're designing a moonshot, so that we're thinking about the social dimension of achieving the goal, but then getting what comes on the other side of it?
Yeah, I want to say about the moment we're in as a country. Our country's in a crisis today, and we are here because of the divisions across our land. The anti-vaccine movement is just one manifestation of it. I think it's very visible to everyone that we have a lot of issues that we're dealing with as a country. And you know, and the vaccine one, of course, is particularly troubling to me because I think about the fact that millions of lives were saved through the COVID vaccines, not just the mRNA vaccines, but all of them together. And I look at what is happening. It's in I grew up in Lubbock, Texas, so next door by Texas standards. And it was in Lubbock that we started first seeing kids dying of measles for the first time in so many decades in this country. So we have a lot of work to do. When I think about what it's going to take to knit us back together across the considerable divides that we have in our country today, I can't think of anything better than finding places where we have enough common ground that we can build again. And it doesn't mean we're going to agree on everything out of the gate, but I think one thing everyone I know in this country can agree on is we want every kid in America to be able to learn to their full potential. And as we show ways to take the successes that are happening in individual classrooms and in individual districts, and we find ways to start scaling them across a state and then ultimately across the country, that to me is going to be one of the most healing things that we can do as a nation. I actually want to key off of one of the questions.
Yeah.
Can we key off of?
Great.
One of the questions that came up on this monitor was about how, when you're trying to do a moonshot, how do you get everyone on board? And I want to tell you a story about people not being on board, because actually I think part of the point of being able to do moonshots, we have to create room to try things before everyone agrees. I told you this mRNA story. Let me tell you a very different story. When a number of years ago, there was a new DARPA program with the objective of having a ship that had no sailors on board, but had enough smarts and capability on board that it could leave the pier, navigate across open oceans for months at a time, without a single sailor on board, with just sparse supervisory control. So someone was paying attention, but the ship was highly, highly autonomous. When the DARPA program manager started this program, the Navy, that was the obvious user of such a unmanned ship, the Navy thought about it, and the Navy decided that the Navy did not like this idea. They tried to get DARPA to stop the program. This started under my predecessor. She was smart enough to know that DARPA doesn't listen to other people. DARPA's job is to do the things that seem crazy to other people. And so we got the program, she got the program started. By the time I came on board, the Navy had gone from outright hostility to mere skepticism. And let me tell you, skepticism is unbelievably valuable. We ended up in a meeting with the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Michelle Howard, in which she was no longer saying, this is stupid, DARPA should stop it. She was now saying, well, I think that's just way too hard. She said, like, how is it going to navigate through the Strait of Malacca? Now, when Admiral Howard asks you how you're going to navigate through the Strait of Malacca, you need to pay attention to Admiral Howard, because she was the rear admiral who was in command in the mission that saved Captain Phillips, if you saw the Tom Hanks movie. And so this woman knows what she's talking about. And when you hear that kind of skepticism from a really knowledgeable individual who's going to have to take this thing forward if we can actually prove the basic capability, then you know what you have to do to prove it. And that is so very, very valuable. So that story continues. And before I left my time as DARPA director, I got to christen the first ever self-driving ship that can leave the pier and navigate across open oceans for months at a time. When we did that, we did it jointly with the Navy, and they then picked it up and ran with it. And so, number one, I think we have to have room to do things before everyone agrees, because by the time everyone agrees, it's going to be pretty incremental. And that's good for getting the incremental things done, but you can't do big, bold things if everyone has to agree up front, number one. But number two, it just doesn't change the world unless you get the technology or the capability or the new method to the point that people do agree. And that broad agreement is what success looks like for these moonshots.
Yeah, and as Arti just did, if folks want to keep adding their questions on the Slido, we can see them, and then we can keep pulling in some of the themes that we're seeing. So I really like that. I mean, I think there's something powerful about you have to treat your skeptics not with derision or they're people you have to sort of work around, but actually like the thing they're bringing to that conversation is actually like a deeper thing. They're actually doing you a favor. It's the canary in the coal mine of like, what is the thing that is going to trip you up later? So Steve, I remember having a conversation with you where you said you're an education researcher. You said one of the problems with being an education researcher is, what is research? You run experiments. And what is the thing that parents always say? I don't want you experimenting on my kid. And it's like, well, what do you want? How do you expect us to figure out which things work or not? It's like, just like, where does knowledge come from? If not, like, where does medicine come from? So I think there's been this tension for when people build an education where we want knowledge building. We want to try things. We want to do the research process and others. But then there's a question around, well, like, what are you doing? And I actually think, like, whether it's the phone line you guys created and others, like, you guys have done a lot of things at a very practical level on the Arti point about how do you build trust even as you're pushing ahead. So you want to talk a little bit about that? Like, which is, like, this is a hard thing because you have to bring people along.
Yeah, so we talk a lot about the product, but in fact, like, we're as much a service company as a product company. We work a lot with teachers and administrators in schools because really what we're trying to do is to change the way they teach, right? The traditional mode of teaching, has always been a teacher sort of lectures, the students take notes, the students maybe do problems for homework, and that's it. And we're trying to really reverse that, where most of the students' time is actually solving problems. So it requires a change in mindset. Right? And when we get to experimentation, which sometimes we'll call field trials or other things to sort of get away from that, but part of the process of getting on board, and I love the comment about skepticism, our biggest skeptics often become our biggest champions, right? Because they're the ones who are actually thinking through what's going on. And so we engage them in helping to design what we're doing. wrong way to do it is to sort of come in and say, well, we want to do this experiment, and there's this condition and that condition, and you're going to go follow. It's much better if you're working with them, so they're helping to co-design that experiment, because the way we frame it with them is they're going to learn for themselves what works. Teachers and administrators are experimenting all the time. They're always doing things differently because they're not satisfied with the results that they're getting, right? But what they're not doing is measuring the results of what they're doing to see whether, you know, when something changes, when the kids' test scores go up or down, is that due to something they did, or is it due to some other factor in the economy or something else, right? You know, and so they understand when you frame it that way, that if we're going to help you understand what's really working for you in your school, that's when you can really get them on board. And I think for education more broadly as a community, like,
do you want to mention the hotline though? I love this idea that like if a teacher has a question about some field trial you're doing, they can just call and you'll like,
yeah.
Well, let's talk through what we're actually testing and why.
We give them up front like exactly what the experiment's gonna be, if there are differences in what students are gonna be seeing or doing, depending on their condition in the experiment. Yeah, and then they can email us or call us if they have any questions. We prepare our support staff to be able to sort of answer questions that they might have. It turns out like we don't get a lot of calls about that, right? Because mostly, like, you know, they may be happy or unhappy with what they're seeing, but they sort of understand it, and it hasn't been much of a problem. Yeah.
And you don't make them talk to a chatbot?
No, they actually talk
Just
to.
checking.
They talk to real people.
So, I guess I think one other thread I sort of want to pull on is, I often think, you know, I had this experience when I was working in government where there are topics where people think ambitious thinking, moonshot thinking is like kind of par for the course, you know? So like, you know, in DARPA world, it's like, oh, we want to pick these DARPA hard problems. You know, people saying, oh, we want to do them in biology or something else. And I remember when I was in the government, one of the first things that really jumped out to me was, you know, the government will publish, this is the science office with the budget office, like a chart, which is like R&D spending for the government. And, you know, I was like working in the science office, but one of my briefs, one of my portfolios was education. So I very excitedly was like, oh, where's going to be the education line in the R&D spend? And it wasn't there. And so I called up the budget office and I was like, why isn't there an education line? And they were like, oh, it's so small that like we don't list it, because like it would just like people would be like, what? You spend this much on defense R&D, this much on health R&D, this much on energy R&D, then a little bit on space R&D, and then like education R&D like is like 0.1% of all education spending and like below this number. So we don't even write it down. And I was like, well, so it's like, how are you going to expect, you know, these sort of breakthroughs if you're not even taking any shots on goal? So I do think that one of the challenges always in education is, at some level, there's always like, what's the silver bullet that we're chasing? But the actual amount of real R&D investment, the actual amount of you know, people's ambition in the field. So you know, Arthur, you've now sat across all these different fields, seeing them, and I'd be curious if, like, you know, just your sort of like outsider lens on education, and whether, you know, there's, you know, we could take it if you're like, oh, actually, education doesn't actually have enough going on to sort of get above the line, or whether like the community actually should be engaging in much more ambitious risk-taking and goal setting that has this moonshot thing. Because, you know, the thing I perceived is like the number of ideas I get that are in the bio space daily for like, we can make this breakthrough if we tried, versus how much of it happens in education or some of the other social sciences is just a lot lower.
Yeah, let me say a couple of things. First of all, federally funded R&D is one of the many democratic institutions that we've built up since the end of the Second World War, very much to our benefit. that is now in crisis today because of the actions of the current administration. And there is so much work to do to limit the damage, to protect the data, the researchers, the whole system that has brought us huge parts of our economy. The entire information revolution came out of that. Cures for diseases came out of that. Adversaries have been deterred and their behaviors have been shaped because of using technology for national security. So that list of what we got from it is long. It's a tragedy that it's at risk today, and we've got a lot of work to do. The fact that we are in this crisis tells me two things. First of all, crises don't last forever, and the day will come when we are no longer in the crisis, and I want to make sure that when that day comes, we are ready to build a better system, because the publicly funded, look, this is R&D that we all funded. We, the people, funded these investments in universities and in government labs and in companies that allowed for these enormous advances that shaped our lives. So the day will come when we get to go back and figure out how we want that to move forward. I just told you how great it is. It's also completely inadequate because we're not doing the work that we need to make sure that every person in every part, regardless of your zip code, regardless of your background, you should be able to have access to enormous opportunities here in the richest country in the world. Our health outcomes are not acceptable for the richest country in the world. So we've got the best R&D system the world has ever seen, literally in all of human history, and it's also inadequate for our future. So when the moment comes that we can build again, we need to look not just to the past, which was glorious, but we need to figure out what the investments are that we, the people, want to make for the decades ahead. Now I'm going to come to education. The need for innovation and advances in K through 12 education has been apparent for a very, very, very long time. I can't remember a time in my adult life when we weren't concerned, and we are more and more concerned about the fact that we're not able to allow our kids to learn to their fullest potential. So there's no question about the problem. What is different today is now there are real opportunities to do something about it. When we started worrying about this, we didn't really feel like we had many tools for innovation. And if you think, we were talking about how medicine used to feel impossible until we started figuring out biology and then using it. If you think biology is complicated, wait till you try to figure out human beings and students, right? We are the most complex, most unpredictable, most hard to understand area of scientific research that you could possibly imagine. So we are finally at the moment where we are starting to have the capacity to do something about this problem. And the reason we have that is because of basic research on neuroscience that we talked about. It's because the philanthropic community has taken some bold bets and has tried different ways of doing R&D and doing experiments, applied R&D of the sort that Kumar and Steve were talking about, where you try to come up with practical solutions and you do them in classrooms to see how it really works. We have real examples of successes if you look at what's happened in Mississippi. When I first heard that Mississippi had been 49th on reading scores, 49th in the country, I thought, okay, well, unfortunately, that's what we've come to expect from Mississippi. When I learned that they were now 9th in the country on reading scores, I was gobsmacked. That's what happens when you can scale the results of research across an entire state. So now I think we are at a junction where we actually we've proven that innovation can do real good in education and change outcomes, not just teach us new things, not just write research papers, but actually change outcomes for our kids and change them at scale. Now I am feeling impatient. I want to get going. I want to make sure we're putting enough resource in so that at the national level, we're fueling these experiments and we're able to do this in a way that reaches every kid. And I do not want to wait an entire generation. I want us to get after it now. And I think that is one of the big opportunities as when we do start working again on how we rebuild in our country and how we rebuild our public investment and R&D, I think this is a premier opportunity going forward.
Yeah, and I think the science of breeding is a huge success story for the field. I mean, it's decades of investment now getting applied at scale, and for the states that are really stepping up and those leaders, you're seeing these huge results. So like a real example. Eden, talk to me about whether you think education or civic engagement is having its moment, should be getting this ambitious push, or where it sort of fits within, because we're obviously living through complicated times. And yeah, how do you when you're like pushing your own team on what does ambitious giving look like, where are the opportunities, where do you sort of rank education?
Yeah, well, if it's okay, I want to just follow up with something Arthi just said about neuroscience and investing in big money, taking big bets, and what you were saying triggered a memory of mine. One of our big bets is with the Institute of Learning and Brain Sciences at the University of Washington. The researchers there really wanted to peer inside a baby's brain and look at how it's developing in real time. And so the researchers there connected with Jackie Bezos, our co-founder, very early on, and they thought bigger. They got together and thought bigger, and they pulled all their resources. They were able to buy something called a Meg machine, which was like one of its kind from like Denmark at the time, shipped it in. In fact, I was just talking to one of the researchers yesterday, and she said that they watched this huge Meg machine come off the crates of the airplane, and Jackie was just mesmerized by the technology. But they did it. They would put the first time the babies had ever been in this Meg machine, and they were watching the baby's brain work in real time. Like, what happens when they hear their mom's voice? What happens when they interact with a toy? What happens when language starts to develop? And it was literally lighting up in the various regions of the brain, which blew us away. But it wasn't just to, for demonstration purposes or to kind of, so often research sits on the shelves and doesn't get put into practice. And so that was a really important part of this, which was they were able to take these lessons and the research and apply them to policy changes, to programs, to families in their houses. And that's just an example of where philanthropy can really step in. We are not inventing the moonshots. We're just getting all of the network of people together and helping them move in the same direction. And now they're using that same technology to apply to adolescent brain development, which is a whole new interesting can of worms. I just wanted to put that example out there.
I mean, I think the neuroscience thread is super interesting, partly just because when you talk to folks in the neuroscience community, they feel like they're at the top of the second inning of like a very long game because, they're like, well, you don't understand, like all the advances we've made so far basically either boil down to research on single neurons or a couple of neurons or like full-on brain scans, fMRIs. And they're like, everything in between is kind of like a hazy understanding. And so much of learning and everything else would sit in deeper understandings of all of that middle of neuroscience. And the technology is getting stronger, but our ability to like actually connect, what Steve is talking about, core ideas we have around learning science, when a student gazes up and is like looking confused, what's happening? Like we're just using like very basic proxies, like you look frustrated, what's happening? But like that's it, right? Where we don't have any deeper understanding that could actually tap in, like neuroscience has like, so there are other fields that sit right next to education that could potentially start to contribute a lot. And I'd be just curious, Steve, like, you're sitting next to the CMU campus. What are the sciences that are happening on campus where you're like, that is going to become a big deal for us at some point?
Yeah. There's a couple of things I could talk about, but with the neuroscience angle, I'll talk about like one product we've been working with called Fast Forward, which is based on the neuroscience of how we acoustically hear the differences in speech. So sounds like "b" and "p" like acoustically are very similar, but the brain sort of makes them sound maximally different. But some students' brains aren't able to do that. They're not able to sort of perceive the acoustic differences. And that all comes from, you see that in the neuroscience research, and then we're able to create a program where students, by listening and responding to sound, so we actually take speech sounds and magnify that transition period so that it's sort of easier to make the transition. It sounds weird from an adult perceptive part, but it makes it easier to tell the difference between a ba and a pa, right? And then you sort and you train it and narrow it down, and then students, it's almost like pre-phonemic awareness, which is sort of the first step in the science of reading that people use. But you have to understand, like, if you're not even ready for that phonemic awareness, we need to train the brain to be aware of that, right? And the other, another thing I'll mention with Carnegie Mellon that we're doing that's a different sort of way of getting insights into students' brains is, or at least the way students are thinking, is we've been working on augmented reality applications. So for many years, we had students use our software in the classroom with the teacher kind of rotating around, and when students raised their hand, they would go over to the student who had their hands raised. And then we started talking to students, and we found a whole bunch of students who said, I wouldn't raise my hand if my hair was on fire. Like, I don't do that, right? And then there's other students who are like, yeah, I call the teacher over every day, all the time. I just love having the teacher over. So we sort of reversed that and said, well, what if we take data from the software in real time, identify which students are we call unproductively struggling. Struggling is sometimes good. Sometimes, like, so that kid who's always calling the teacher over, it's just because you're a little bit confused. No, work it out for yourself. But there are other kids who are making mistakes, they're unproductive, they're not improving from their own mistakes. That's where the teacher can be most effective. And so what we've done is given, this is with Vincent Alevin and others at Carnegie Mellon, we've given the teachers these augmented reality glasses so they can look out on the classroom, and over the kids' heads, they see indicators of who's struggling, and then they see the data that they need to know and the recommendations so that as they're walking over to that student's desk, they know exactly what's going on with that student, right? And they say, like, it's a way of sort of seeing into my students' heads, understanding their way of thinking.
Yeah, so I just think there's so much that like we don't know. It creates lots of opportunities. Just as we're closing out, I'd be curious, I mean, one of the kind of questions we've gotten is just like, how should I bring this to my own life? You know, what's my personal moonshot? How does one bring it? You know, we just, at Renaissance Philanthropy, just today actually launched a Substack where the first post is by Tom on like, how does moonshot thinking a way that one can actually be bringing to their own work? So I just, as a quick rapid fire, what's like a thing you want someone to walk out of the room and just like how this can be practical ways to just organize one's life? Arti?
Moonshot has two parts. One is knowing where it is you want to go, being very, very clear about that. And then I think one of the most powerful questions when you're trying to do hard things is, what does it take to get there? So I like both of those, being clear about what the goal is and then what does it take to get there.
Awesome. Eden?
There's so much I could say. Well, our North Star is, you know, helping everybody live to their full potential and meaningfully contribute to their communities. And so our vision is our moonshot. I don't know how we get there yet, but we're working on it.
Well, all together. And Steve?
I'll say one of the things that we find is that every student can learn if you give them the opportunity, if you motivate them properly and you also take them seriously. Right? Understand, like, if they're making mistakes, don't give up on them. Understand where those mistakes are and lean into it. It's amazing how much difference that makes in teachers and in parents, too.
And how do you sort of carry that to, like, your team?
Yeah, it's about, again, like, trying to understand student thinking, convey that to the teacher and to the student, so that, like, the worst thing for a student, to me, is if you're in class and you say, hey, this is the way I'm thinking about solving this problem. The teacher says, well, this is algebra class. We don't do it that way. Do it this way, right? Like, it's just a direct statement like, you don't belong here.
Help, right? Don't give the answer.
So think about, like, yeah, take that thinking seriously and figure out, like, okay, if it's incorrect, correct it. if it's correct, there's a lot of good ways of solving problems that we need to acknowledge and allow students to do.
Well, I want to thank all of you. Your questions were incredibly helpful. We sort of kept pulling them in. And I want to thank this incredible panel. And thank you for joining us today.